Good morning, everybody, or good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. If you would like to, in the live chat, you can post who you are, where you're from, and it'd be interesting just to see where everybody's coming from. Let me turn down my iPad because I forgot to turn off its volume, and I can now hear myself, and that's kind of weird. Today's episode, we're going to talk about security setup with Ansible, and in particular, security setup on a Linux server, assuming that you have a Linux virtual machine or instance running in the cloud and has internet connectivity. Last week, we talked about testing with Ansible, and if you want to have a robust, maintainable infrastructure, it's a good idea to have all of these different components in place, making sure that you have security set up, making sure security is an important thing that you check and evaluate on your infrastructure. Also making sure you have testing in place. So that these few episodes are going to cover some of that maintenance-focused section because it's interesting. Some people think that security is something that you kind of patch on afterwards, after you get something running. But if you don't really think about it from a deep architecture perspective, you can end up making a lot of costly mistakes that not only impact security down the line, leading to hacks and things, but it can also lead to performance issues and problems where you open yourself up to risks of denial of service attacks, things like that. But before we get started with that, I wanted to cover a little bit of our agenda today. First of all, thank you so much to everybody who sponsored me on GitHub and Patreon. A couple new sponsors. Benny Mac has decided to be very generous in helping me out. I know he uses some of my Ansible content for Typo 3, and it's interesting, Typo 3 is a PHP-based system, a CMS that's similar in some aspects to Drupal, but the Typo 3 community, which is an open source community just like Drupal's, has teamed up with Drupal and with other open source PHP communities in a really cool way to make some neat things happen in the past few years, so that's awesome. Also, Adam Modras, thank you as well, and then Lewis on Patreon. Everybody who's sponsoring me there is helping me. My goal is to try to get to $1,000 a month in revenue from those sources to be able to devote a dedicated amount of time to open source work every week, which will help me with my Ansible role maintenance, my container maintenance for Docker images, some Kubernetes things. So I already do as much work as I can there, but I don't have the ability to dedicate as much time to that just because I have a family and I have my paying work and things like that. If I can make this happen, then that would be really awesome. Also, interestingly, I didn't mention this in the agenda here, but last week I mentioned I had 10,000 subscribers on the YouTube channel, which was a lot of you who are looking at these Ansible 101 series. But right after I mentioned that, apparently the thumbnail probably had some impact on it, but the content of the Ansible Turing Pi cluster running Kubernetes that I'm still working on some of those episodes, a couple of those episodes kind of took off, and now I almost have 20,000 subscribers. So I haven't even thought about what I might do for the next milestone, which would be 25,000 subscribers, but I'm sure it will be something interesting. And thank you for subscribing to everybody who has. And if you want to keep seeing my content that I'm posting on that and on Ansible and other things, you can click subscribe right below here and get that information. One question from last episode was Sufayani75, whoever that is, said, I don't think you need the quotes on line 3, and what they were referring to was this GitHub, the GitHub workflow action for CI. And Shabazahad, thank you for the support, and down payment for a DevOps guitar solo. You might notice I have behind me here this electric guitar. On my last video that I was doing, I had a time lapse and I accidentally broke one of the guitar strings. If you go frame by frame, you might see that moment. But I am not a good guitarist by any means, and I am just barely adequate at a beginner level, but it's something that I've always wanted to do. So I have an acoustic guitar and this electric guitar, and actually an old classical guitar upstairs, and I'm just trying to learn how to play some songs, pluck in some strings. So yeah, maybe that'd happen someday. Maybe that could be if we get to some other level of support, or maybe if there's 100,000 subscribers, I'll make a Kubernetes song or something crazy like that. But anyway, on this CI workflow, I put on in quotes here, and technically that's not necessary. Technically, and in GitHub Actions documentation, they have it like this with no quotes. If you ever use on or one, or like if you use one here or zero, which would be a horrible idea for many reasons, on, or if this is true, you'll see that my YAML syntax highlighter actually identifies this as a Boolean and not a string. And the keys should be strings all the time. And so that's whoever designed this in GitHub Actions to call it on these actions. I get what they were doing. It's like on these things, do something. But the reason why I quote it is because A, I want my YAML syntax highlighting to not identify it as a Boolean. And B, some situations, not GitHub Actions parser, but some parsers may interpret that as a Boolean and screw some things up there. So that's why I do it. And it also throws a warning with the default YAML int roles. So it's valid either way for GitHub Actions, but I like being a little bit more formal. And since this is a string value and not a Boolean, I like to put it in quotes. Anyways, that's neither here nor there. We're going to get into episode 9 content now. And also interesting, it looks like we have some people from the Philippines, Austria, Macau, Maryland, Ohio. Awesome. So Indonesia, all kinds of places. And I'm really bad with names. Shabazahad is saying Jeff at 144p. Hopefully you can see me a little bit better than that. If you ever get onto a YouTube stream and it gives you a really low quality content, you usually can click the little dots and get, or I guess the little gear icon, and get a higher stream rate. I'm streaming in 60 frames per second, and it says I'm not dropping any frames, so it should be pretty clear. But let's get into our topic today, which is the first 5-minute server security setup with Ansible. And I'm working from chapter 10 in my book, Ansible for DevOps, which you can get using the link in the description below. And it's something that, as I said, it should be something architectural. Whenever you're building infrastructure, security has to be something you consider from the outset. And this example that I'm going to give today and the book itself is some of the basics, some of the first things. A lot of people call it like the first 5 minutes, security. Because in the old days, this was like you built a new server and then immediately you'd spend 5 minutes setting up these very basic server security settings, making sure that you install a few things and tweak a few settings for sudo and all that. So that's what we're going to cover today. Obviously, today we have a lot more options like AMIs that you can pre-build in Amazon EC2 or whatever cloud provider instances. You can pre-build images. You also might have Docker containers, which are running in an environment that's already secured and set up for you. And so some of the security considerations are different. But the point of this is that the more automation you have for building those AMIs or deploying those Docker images or setting up the security for the servers themselves that run them, the better off you're going to be. And Ansible can help with all that security setup. Ansible has a full suite of security integrations with different platforms, and it's good to know how to do all that. But for the very basics, a lot of us still run bare servers here and there, and we need to know how to set things up. For instance, I have my Raspberry Pis. This one is not commissioned right now. It's not running. But whenever I set up a new one of these, I need to immediately secure it. Even though it's on my home network, I have some Internet of Things devices on my network that I don't trust fully. So I want to make sure that it's as secure as possible out of the box. And so when I set them up, the first thing I'll do usually is run some security tasks. The things that I always focus on first, I'm going to put these on the screen, and there's a lot of them, and I hope you're not taking notes because A, this is a video and you can play it back, and B, this is actually in the book in version 1.20. It's on page 279, but you don't need to write these down. But these are the things that I worry about on Linux. If you're on Windows, a few things are a little bit different, but some of the things are the same in principle. And if you're using containerized infrastructure, some of these things are still very important, especially if you're using Kubernetes, where you might leave a few things open. But I'll run through them really quick. The first one, which I'll talk a little bit more in depth on, is making sure that you're using secure and encrypted communication so that your communication lines can't be tracked and picked up and hacked into. Another one is making sure that root doesn't have login capabilities on your server. Instead, you use sudo on Linux so that you can elevate privileges. You should also make sure that anything you're not using is not running. That's a pretty basic thing, but you'll be surprised sometimes when you build a new instance somewhere and Apache's running, and it's like, why is this running? This is not a web server. I shouldn't have this running, but it might be. Also, make sure that only the required ports are open on your servers. Don't have anything extra open because that can lead to vulnerabilities. Use the principle of least privilege, so in your file system and in your access, and if you're using containers, make sure that they don't have any privileges that they don't need, especially if you're testing in Molecule, and we added last week the ability for the container to use privileged in Docker, which basically lets the container run as root on your system. That's not a great idea most of the time. Only very rarely is that a good idea. So for instance, when I'm using trusted software and I'm testing in a CI environment, I might do that, but outside of that, it's you have to be a lot more guarded. Update the OS and installed software. Surprisingly, this is something a lot of people don't ever do, and so you see a server out there running like PHP 5.2 on CentOS 5, and it's still running a production website for a Fortune 500 company, and that is not even sarcasm. That is happening still today. But just updating things will help, but also making sure that you have a good update procedure with the ability to roll back. Using a properly configured firewall, we'll talk about that. Make sure log files are populated and rotated, and if you have modern infrastructure that has lots of containers running or lots of servers running, you want to use some sort of centralized logging system that gives you the capability to see those logs and scan them and get statistics out of them, that kind of thing. Monitoring logins, blocking suspect IP addresses just helps with the ability to control people who are trying to hack into your servers. And finally, use SE Linux. This one is probably the most controversial in the list, but I'll get to why I have it in my list of basic security in a few minutes. But let's get into it. So the first thing is using secure and encrypted communications. This is one thing where Ansible itself is one of the reasons why I chose to use Ansible is because it doesn't require any extra daemons running on your servers. It's agentless, and it uses SSH, and SSH is the industry standard for server-to-server communications and controlling servers and things like that. But to give a little bit of explanation and background about SSH, in the book I have a whole section, a brief history of SSH and remote access, but I'll summarize that. And basically, when we started with computers, it was basically mainframes, so big computers running in a closet or room somewhere, and it had a terminal attached to it, or multiple terminals, but it was in a physical building with physical locks and things like that. So there wasn't a huge need at that time for encryption from the terminal to the server because there was like one wire, and the person using the server could see that wire going over to the server. But as time went on, the computers, whether mainframe or other types of computers, started to become networked together more. And as that happened, we needed to be able to manage them remotely, maybe over a modem, over the phone lines, that kind of thing, or university to university, that sort of thing. So telnet started to become a new TCP protocol that let you control systems and send commands using TCP from different places. Telnet was not encrypted, and it wasn't very secure. And over time, that started to fall out of favor. But still, you might use telnet sometimes for configuring a device, like a printer or something like that, or even some services like Munin use the telnet protocol for giving data from different servers. But that's one area where if you do need to use something like telnet, you should make sure that the port is locked down to only be able to be accessed from one particular server or whatever servers need to access that, because it's not a secure protocol. And I put in the book something that's kind of illustrative of why this is important to lock things down if they're not encrypted, or to try to get them encrypted. If you run traceroute.google.com from your computer, which I can do here, traceroute.google.com, and you can see that So first it goes to my router, and then if I let this go for a while, which I may or may not, it's going to hop all over the internet. It's going to go through my ISP, it'll go through my regional networking system, eventually it'll hit google.com. But whenever you're doing anything on the internet or controlling your servers, every request that you do is going to be hopping through all these servers and infrastructure. And do you trust every single one of these? You know, this might be in an office somewhere in Illinois, and what if there's a bad actor that has a server monitoring all the traffic on that server? So we want to make sure that all of our communications are encrypted. In 1983, a new protocol was introduced, rlogin, which was, I think it was first in BSD, and it had the same kind of setup as telnet overall, but it was more structured for remote server administration, and it had the ability to use passwordless login. So it was a little bit easier. It was more friendly to the users who were logging into servers than telnet, and it became fairly popular for a decade or so. But in 1995, a new system was set up called Secure Shell, and Secure Shell changed everything a bit because people started realizing, you know what, it's not great to be transferring all these text streams around that can be snooped on, and anybody between your computer and the server can find it. So let me clear that out. So SSH was created, and initially it was built under the umbrella of the SSH Communications Security Corporation, but the licensing was a little bit crazy. So OpenBSD decided to clean it up, improve it, and release it in OpenBSD 2.6 in December 1999. And quickly from that point, it was ported and put into all the flavors of Linux, and now we use it today. And I forget what the current version is, like OpenSSH 7 or 8 or something like that. But every version has added more security features, added more convenience features, and made it a little bit more robust. So the way that SSH works is, instead of logging into a server and just having a TCP connection and kind of sending text streams over it, when you enter your SSH, whatever your username is at a host name, you and the host exchange your keys and then build a new encryption key that's used for that session. And the remote system has a list of authorized keys, which is public keys that can connect to it. And that's how it sets it up. I'm not going to go into the detail because it's already 17 minutes into this episode, and we don't want to just talk about how SSH and encryption works the whole time. If you are interested in learning a little bit more about it from a more dramatic and interesting perspective, there's a good book called Crypto, I think it is, that covers some of the history of cryptography and communications and computers, and talks about the kind of some of the culture behind it too. But SSH kind of stems out of that whole era and timeline of computer cryptography. SSH also has some other things that are useful little utilities, like SCP for secure copying of files, and SFTP, which is basically secure FTP, so FTP over SSH, which is a lot more secure than plain FTP. So if you ever see an open FTP server on the internet, unless it's just letting you download files like you would over HTTP, it's a good idea to get that behind SFTP. You can also do port forwarding, so you could run services over remote servers through kind of a tunnel to your local server encrypted, and X11 forwarding, so you can use X windows securely from remote servers. So there's a lot of other things you can do with SSH, but when you have SSH running, there's a few things that are the best practices to be able to do with it. One is to disable password-based authentication. This is something where, you know, you might think, well, you know, a password is good because it's something that only you know, or, you know, if you use a password manager, only the password manager knows. Keys are a little more convenient and a lot easier for automation than passwords. And if you use a password, you have to store a short, usually they're shorter. You wouldn't have a super long password somewhere. And with a key, the key is usually a lot more, it's a lot longer, a lot more entropy in it. So it's usually better to use key-based authentication. So most people disable password-based authentication. You also don't want to allow root login remotely for a few different reasons, but the main one is it's just not a good practice to ever log in as root. and to be mindful of when you're doing things as root, because if somebody gets root access to your server, then it's immediate ownership. So at a minimum, you'd want to use a different user with sudo capabilities and allow them to do anything with sudo, but that's at least a tiny bit of protection compared to just logging in as root. Also, you want to make sure that only users that need to be able to access. So in terms of our infrastructure that I always set up, it's users like automation users, like an Ansible user or an automation user. A lot of my servers, I also have a geerlingguy user for me, and that user often has more restrictions. Like I can only sudo to manage a certain service or two, like Apache or MySQL or something. I can't do anything on the system. The Ansible user or the automation user that connects to the server can do everything that that user needs to do. And that's the principle of least privilege, which we can talk about a little bit later. And finally, one thing that it doesn't offer more security per se, but it does offer a tiny bit of protection from denial of service attacks and things like that, port scans, is if you run SSH on a different port. By default, it's on port 22. But if you ever set up a server and just start monitoring that server and have SSH open on port 22, even if it's very secure otherwise, you'll notice that there's just tons and tons of people running scripts trying to hit your server and log in on port 22. So if you move it to another port and close port 22, that's some traffic that you can cut off immediately from your servers. So we'll cover that in just a minute. One other note is that SSH requires a constant TCP connection to the server, and so sometimes you might notice, like I have a lot of servers in the Netherlands because that's one of the data centers that I host my European stuff in. And sometimes when I'm connecting to those, especially if I'm on the road and using my phone's connection, you're typing things and you type it and it's like, I just want to see how the server's doing. So I'm like free-m, and obviously it's not on my Mac, but I type it and it's like this and then that and then that. So there's a new shell called Mosh that is a mobile shell. It's very similar to SSH, and it uses the same kind of backend protocols, but it lets you type, and it has kind of buffers between your local and remote. So it works a little bit better with a connection that's less reliable. And there's some other things that may come down the line, but SSH is still a very standard and very secure communication technique, and that's why we use it in Ansible. Somebody in the live chat, I believe, mentioned something about a good book on SSH mastery. So there's definitely a lot more that you can find that's outside of my book. My book devotes maybe 4 pages to it total. There's a lot that you can learn, and a lot that you can configure in your SSH configuration, either locally when you're connecting to servers or on the server that's running SSH. And we're going to change a few settings here. I have a server that is running in Amazon EC2 right here, and I have it's just the default server set up from Amazon for CentOS 7. So if I SSH into it as the CentOS user, I can connect, and I think that Amazon has root login disabled, but other than that, none of the other suggestions that I've mentioned previously are there. So this is connecting on port 22. And if I sat there monitoring it, I'm sure somebody on this live stream is already trying to connect to it and figure out if they can hack it before I get to it. But we're going to do a few things to make sure that the SSH configuration is better. So another quick thing too is that I haven't mentioned, and I don't think we've done on this live stream, I have the servers defined in my inventory, but since variables sometimes get a little bit more complicated, or I just like writing variables as YAML, you can use this group vars folder in a playbook and put in all.yaml, and this will be picked up for all groups and all servers, and these variables will apply, just like if I had put this into the inventory file, which we've done previously. If I did CentOS vars and put it here like this in INI syntax, I could do it that way, but like I said, I like using YAML for my variables. So I have Ansible user CentOS, and this is my private key that connects to that CentOS server. So Ansible can run a playbook against this, or I can run Ansible commands. And I have a playbook that does all of these wonderful things. It runs the no-op task, which is, it just doesn't do anything. But this is a quick way, whenever I'm building a playbook, if I want a quick way to, I could either do this or I can put in made a no-op, and that lets me start filling in my tasks. So I can run this playbook right now, main.yaml, and it'll run nothing since there's no tasks in here against that server. But the first thing we're going to do is update SSH's configuration. And since this is a sent to us server, I'm going to need to also tell SE Linux, Security Enhanced Linux, about the fact that I'm about to change the port of SSH. So first I'm going to make a task, tell SE Linux about SSH's new port, and I'll put a task SE port, which is a module in Ansible that lets you configure ports in SE Linux. So I'll say ports 2849, protocol is TCP, SE type is SSH port T, and state is present. So I want to make sure that I have that configuration in SE Linux. Otherwise, if I don't do that, I'm about to change the port that SSH is running on. What will happen is I'll restart SSH, and then I'll get locked out from the server, because SE Linux will say, hey, SSH is only configured to use port 22, and it's trying to run on a different port, so I'm going to shut that down. So SE Linux is going to now be like, okay, you can run on 2849. So the next task, we're going to update SSH's configuration. So I'm going to log into the server and show you what it is by default. So if I go to cat etc ssh /ssh config, like that. This is the default file, and it has some good explanation of all the different options in here. But a few of the things, SSH, oh, did I do SSH deconfig? Sorry about that. And it's access denied, so I'll do sudo. So here's the SSH deconfig. It has all the different options. A few of the ones that we're most interested in is we don't want to allow password authentication. So it looks like the default for that is good already, but we're still going to verify that. We also don't want to permit root login, which is, where is it? It's somewhere in here. Oh, here, permit root login. So the default is yes. We want to change that to no. And then we also want to change the port. Right now, the default is port 22. So we want to make sure that those changes are in this file. And I could just edit this file here and do that, but we're using Ansible, so we're not going to do it that way. We're going to add a task, make sure SSH is more secure. And I'm going to use the line in file module. And I'm going to give it the destination file, which is etc ssh sshd config. And then state present. And I need, I want to change 3 different things. The password authentication, make sure that that's no, it already is, but I want to make sure of it. Permit root login, I want to make sure that that's set to no. And then port, I want to set to 2849. So I'm going to have 3 items and use with items in this task. So let's see, I'm going to do with items. Regexp is password authentication line, password authentication no, and then I'll copy this a couple times because I'm going to do a similar thing for each one of these. We'll do permit root login, permit root login no, and for the regular expression, this is just saying the beginning of the line. This is the first thing on the line. So any line that begins with this, match it, and then make sure that the line equals that. And then this one is port. So I'm going to make sure the port line says port 2849. And it's probably a good idea if we set this to a variable. We don't have to do that, but that way we could change the port more easily in the future. But right now I just need to make sure that this has regexp, and that is going to be item.regexp, because this will be a loop, and then line, it'll be item.line, like that. And the other thing that happens is we can change this file, but it's not going to make any difference because SSH is running as a daemon. So we need to set up a handler to be able to restart SSH for us once we make this change to this line. So I'm going to add a handler section here, name restart SSH, and then service name SSHD, can't spell, there we go, state restarted. And then I have to notify it here, notify restart SSH, so that when it changes this file, it'll restart SSH and all these new settings will take effect. Now, one thing to keep in mind whenever you're messing with the SSH configuration is the first time you do it, there's a very high likelihood you're accidentally going to lock yourself out of the server. So one trick is if you're ever going to mess with SSH configuration, have another session, whoops, I'm opening lots of windows. Have another session open and log into your server, which is, where is it? Inventory. Log into your server there. Where am I? My goodness, I'm all over the place here. Log into your server there so that you're logged in case you blow up your SSH configuration. That way you can go back and fix things with your logged in session. Just a little thing that I've learned from burning myself by blowing up servers over the years doing this. All right, and someone's mentioning loop versus with items. You can use loop here. I just use with items because I like the with suite of options. There was a point in time when someone said, oh, that with items and with all these things is going away, but that decision was walked back. So if anybody is ever like, well, you should use loop instead of this or with or whatever, you can use any of these options. The point is that this is going to be a loop, and the first time that this task is run, it's going to use the first item in this list. The second time it will use the second item, and so forth and so on. All right, so this should change the security, the SSH settings, and not blow up the server. We'll see if that's the case. Ansible playbook main.yaml, and we'll see. So the first one, it was already set that way, but the second two, it did change it, and then it restarted SSH. Now there's a problem. In Ansible, if I run this playbook again, it's going to fail because SSH just changed the port that it was running on. And that's interesting. It should fail because I don't have it set to the different port. What's going on here? It's running. 21 seconds it restarted. That's a little weird. I wonder if there's some sort of caching going on, because I should have to change this to port 2849 to work. And again, this is the fun of a live demo. I didn't actually test this last night, so I'm going to change this to Ansible SSH port 2849. And this, it'd be weird if both of these can work because it should only be working on 2849. And it is there. And Valentin is asking, or Valentine, I'm not sure the pronunciation there, but Valentin is asking if why not just use a template for this. That's definitely a valid option, especially if you're going to change a lot more things. If it's just a couple lines in a file, I usually use line in file, or if it's one little section in a file, I use block in file. You can also use templates for these things. And long term, if you do have to modify different parts of it for different things, a template is a way better solution. But for this simple example, I'm just using line in file. So this is interesting. I'm going to exit here and try connecting again. So this is refusing. I don't know why it worked on Ansible. If I do port 22, this is puzzling me. Okay, now it's, I don't know why that allowed me to do it on port 22 the last time. Anyway, so now we're using port 2849. That'll cut down on some of the background traffic of people who just blindly try to log into port 22 on every server everywhere. And then the next thing that we're going to do is make sure that sudo is used for everything. So a thing that I mentioned earlier was I usually try to have different accounts. Like there's an automation account that might have access to almost everything on the server, or in some simple cases, it just has sudo access to do any command as root. And then I also have other users who can do some smaller amounts of things. That configuration is set up in your server's sudoers file. So I'll log in here, and then I'll use the different port. What is it? 2849. And that is etc/sudoers. That's probably permission denied, so I'll use sudo there. So this file configures all the different accounts that can access, can use sudo on the system. Now, an interesting thing that it was late at night last night when I was glancing over this chapter and writing my wonderful notes in it. I was like, you know, I've seen this wheel group forever, and I've never understood why is it called wheel. So I thought there must be some meaning to it. So I looked it up, and apparently there used to be a phrase, at least in the US, like the big wheel. I've heard of the big cheese, like somebody who has all the power or the access or control. So apparently this was a term that was used from post-World War II into maybe the 70s and 80s. And it was, the big wheel was like the person who had the power and the control. So the wheel group is the group on the server that has all the power and control, at least on BSD-like systems. Some of the, I think on Ubuntu and Debian, there's a sudo group, which makes a little more sense nowadays since we don't have the context of that phrase, the big wheel. And also outside of the US, I don't know if that was ever used at all. It'd be interesting if any of our British viewers know if that was a phrase that was common in the UK. I know I haven't heard of that phrase anywhere else in the world, so, but I think it might even stem from the fact that early like horse-drawn carriages or things like that had bigger wheels the more powerful they were, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, just an interesting aside that I probably spent a few more minutes than I should have trying to research all the aspects of why this is named wheel. But there's a lot of interesting things like that in the history of computer science. Anyways, so back to actually editing this file and setting up a user to have that become access. I'm going to add a user account. So name, add user John Doe, and I'll use the user module, name John Doe. So this user could be anything. I could be creating a service account or Jane Doe or whatever. But I'm going to modify the sudoers file so that this user has the access to do sudo with no password. So they could do anything on the server using sudo. Add sudo group rights for deployment user. And there's a couple different ways I could do this. One is I could add this user to groups wheel, so they could be in that wheel group, which can run all commands. Or I can also configure it on the individual level and give different privileges to each user. In this case, I'm just going to give similar privileges, but I'm going to use line and file just like I did for the last one. And I'm going to give destination is etc/sudoers. Regexp is John Doe. Make sure that this also helps for idempotent. So right now there's no line for John Doe in here. So when this runs, it's going to add a line for him. But then the next time it runs, it's going to see that his line already exists and it won't make any changes to it. And I should probably spell this correctly if I'm going to want to make it work. And then line John Doe all equals all, no password, all. And the syntax, which I'm not going to get into here, is similarly well documented outside of this book and live stream if you want to learn more about sudoers syntax. State present. All right, and then another thing that's important for sudoers, you also don't want to screw up this file. For the SSH config, I don't believe there's a built-in utility to validate its configuration. And that's why I usually log into the server itself when I'm messing with it, so that if I mess myself up, I can get in and fix it. But for this, there's actually a command called vsudo, which lets you validate the file using input from Ansible. So Ansible in the line and file, block and file, and template, and I think the copy module too. You can use this validate option. and pass it a command to run to validate that the changes were right before it restarts a service or commits the changes to the file. So I'm going to say validate vi sudo -cf and then %s gives it the file. And that should do it. And if I run this playbook again, it should, I have two apostrophes there. Just need one. Okay, let's try that again. So this should create the user and then give that user sudo rights. And to show how this works, I can make this, let's see, some way to make this invalid test or something like that. And Ansible will try to make that change and then the validation will fail. I believe that that's invalid, but we'll see if it is or not. Apparently that's valid. Testing, I don't know. Some way we can make this configuration fail. And that might actually be valid too. Oh, actually, so KD King says that there is a tool for validating the SSH configuration. So we should probably add that up here too. Validate. And he says sshd-t-f%s. And I should probably add that to the book too. So let's try that out. Okay, so this failed to validate because there's a syntax error. And let me, instead of retyping that, I'm going to go back to this all and pop in this validate here. And let's see if that's good. All right, so that's good. And then to test that that validation works, let's try fizz or something like that, which is not a Boolean. Always the great thing about these live streams is I almost never have the ability to test and make sure everything's working. Okay, so yeah, that's good. Nice. So learn something new every day. I didn't realize that that was built in, and this will now save me from killing myself access to the servers whenever I do this. So thank you very much. Who is that again? We should all give him a clap emoji or something. Oh, and apparently some of the, YouTube is barfing on some of these commands. It keeps hiding them from the live chat because it has, I guess it looks like a hacker or something since it has Linux commands in it. Anyway, thank you very much. Give a clap emoji to whoever that was, which I can't find in there. KD King. Oh, and it looks like Valentin also stuck that in there. Anyway, so now we have the sudo rights set up for that user, and that user could use become in Ansible or can use sudo to connect. So I'll run this now that it's all good. Make sure it's all idempotent. Another thing that you would want to do on a server, especially if you're using, so this is an Amazon EC2 instance, and the AMI is from CentOS, so I trust it pretty much. But a lot of times you'll be using servers that might be set up by other hosts. Like I have for server check-in, I have some hosts that are running on cheaper providers who might not have as much security rigor in their process of image building. And so they might do things like have Apache running on the base minimal install. And I don't want that to happen if I don't have a server that needs Apache running. So I'm also going to make sure that, when I set up the server, I can go into it and get a process list, check what's running on it, and make sure that anything that I don't want running and don't want installed is not running and not installed. So I would have a task like remove unused packages. And even if you have servers that you don't delete and recreate all the time, anytime that you change something and remove something that you don't need anymore, make sure that you have a task that makes sure it's removed. So if you started using Apache and switched to Nginx, first of all, the ports are probably going to give you a little bit of a fit until you remove Apache, but make sure that you uninstall it and remove everything on it if you have a server that's going to persist. So I might have a task like package name HTTP and then nano, mail utils, whatever kind of packages you don't need on the server, make sure that they're removed. State absent. And if you're using apt, you also might want to throw in the purge. I can't spell. There we go. Yes. You might also want to throw in the purge option for this to make sure that it's all gone. But you can do that and make sure that things that you don't need on the server are not there. Also, let's see. Also, just making sure when you're on a server itself, SSH, you can run PS and check what's running. If there's something on there that's like, I don't really need that running. Some of these obviously are for Amazon. The EC2 instances need them to be running for storage and all that. But if there's something in here that you don't really need to be running, it's a good idea to kill that service in your playbook and make sure it's always gone and not going to run. Let's see what else. Principle of least privilege. One thing is to make sure that when you're setting up these users, like this user is getting full sudo access. Does this user actually need full sudo access? Probably not. It's always better to grant privileges more granularly. So if this person only needs access to the web directory and needs to update files in it for their little web application and then restart Apache, you should probably tweak it to only do those kind of things. But another thing too is making sure that file permissions are correct. I come originally from a PHP background. I think I mentioned that in one of the earlier episodes. And in the PHP community, it's a common meme that people go into a server. There's nothing there because it's not. It doesn't have Apache installed. But they'll go into their HTML directory and they'll just do a chmod -r777 and change every file permission to 777 on the file system. And luckily, things like SE Linux and containers can kind of limit the damage they can cause by doing that sometimes. But you still need to know and use the correct file permission. So I have this pretty much committed to memory nowadays. But early on, I was always struggling to figure out, how does this work when I use Ansible's file module or when I copy things? How do I make sure that the permissions are right and make sure, how do I also remember the mapping of read, write, and execute privileges? And this is the way my brain works, but your brain is likely different. So there's other graphs of this all over the internet that you can look up for trying to remember how octals match to the string permissions for RWX and how that matches to different permissions listings that you might use with other software. But in Ansible, the typical way is to give a mode. So let me go back to my screen share here. And let's say I have a file name, edit file permissions, and I have a file path. What is it? So we'll have this file, the SSH config. We want it to be read write for root only. So here's the text permissions, which is the user, and then the group, and then the world. And obviously the world can't do anything to this, and the group, the root group can't do anything, but the user root can do read and write. So to match that up in here, we'd say path would be etc/ssh/sshd config, and then we'd say mode is what is it? Read write. Let me go back. Read write is 6, right? So 600. But in Ansible, if you just did this will trip you up because Ansible needs an octal, which is four digits and not 3. So this first one, we're not going to get into that today, but there are some settings in there that you can change. But these are the file permissions that match up to these permissions here. So we want to make sure that this is 600, which is read write, and then no access, no access. And again, getting back to that file permissions graph, you can see that it's the number 6 there is read write. And another thing that I use to kind of remember this is that the 1 is execute, the 2 is write, and the 4 is read. And then all the other ones are just addition. So read and execute is 4 plus 1, which equals 5. And read write is 4 plus 2, which is 6. And read write execute is 4 plus 2 plus 1, which is 7. So over time, you can kind of get that down. A lot of people watching this probably already know this by heart, probably even better than me, but I know for somebody beginning with file permissions, this can trip you up, and then you might spend a lot of time going to file permission calculators online just to remember how to translate one into the other. Anyway, so file permissions always make sure that you only give the permissions to something that are needed. Don't give SSH, or don't give 777 to everything. That's the cheater's way out, and usually will lead to major problems later in life. But if I run this playbook, that should result in no changes because the file is already set up as 600 with just read-write for the user. Let's see, anything else in there? No. Another thing is to make sure that things are updated. So you could have a playbook. I wouldn't usually do this in the main playbook, but you could have a separate playbook called updates, or you could even do it on the command line. But it would basically be make sure everything's up to date, and you'd say, use the yum module with name, everything, and state latest. That would update everything. For apt, if you had Ubuntu or Debian, you would have something like upgrade dist, like that, and then update cache. Yes, something along those lines. There's some other gotchas to making sure everything's up to date, and sometimes you need to reboot afterwards. So I usually have a separate playbook, and I have on my blog at jeffgeerling.com that playbook listed that I use for updating everything. And sometimes it's handy to have that available, especially in automation, so that if something like Heartbleed comes out in the future, you can immediately go to your automation, click a button, and update all your servers and have them rebooted if needed right away. So that's that. And then also, if you want to make sure that your servers are always up to date, all distributions have an auto update mechanism built into them. Well, not built into them, but able to be integrated with them easily. And so for CentOS 7, I want to set up auto updates. So I'm going to use yum to install yum cron. And again, for all these, I'm guessing somebody has mentioned this in the chat today, but you could use package to make it more cross-platform. But the problem is, in this case, it's not a problem, but in this case, this is only ever going to work on a CentOS system unless you hack yum into a Debian or apt or something. So I usually just use yum if I know it's going to be specific only to Red Hat. That's a way for me to see, oh, this is for Red Hat, CentOS, Fedora only, or DNF if you're using a more modern version. But in this case, I'm using CentOS 7, so I can use yum there, state present, and then you can make sure that it's running in the background, so it will always keep things up to date and ensure auto updates are running. Service name yum cron, state started, enabled. Yes, that'll make sure that it's enabled on boot up. So this uses the default configuration, and it just makes sure that the server is updated. I think it's like every night it checks for updates. You can tweak things and make sure you can exclude certain packages from that. You can exclude repos. You can change the way it does security settings. I think you can even set it to reboot the server when it needs to. And there's something similar for apt. A quick note is that on CentOS 8 or Red Hat 8 or Fedora 29 or 31, I don't remember what the first version was that had this, since it uses DNF now, it's not yum cron anymore, it's DNF automatic. And the service that you want to run is DNF automatic install.timer. And this is what's going to do the auto updates for you. So I'm going to leave this as yum cron because this is a CentOS server. For Debian-based systems, you use the unattended upgrades package. So not yum cron because obviously there is no yum on Debian or Ubuntu. But you'd use unattended upgrades. And there's an example for that in the book. It's also... I'll tell you about where you can get all of these things in one pretty little package in a few minutes. But now at this point, the server will automatically update its packages every night with using the default configuration, which you can tweak, but we're not going to get into that too much today. We do want to talk a little bit about firewalls. So this server is running in Amazon EC2, and EC2 uses security groups, which lets you have the network policies for firewalls and ports and things are controlled on the provider level in EC2. And that's very secure, and you should use that feature and functionality. And other platforms like GCP and Azure also have that, but some don't. If you're using a smaller VPS provider or something like that, they usually give all the ports open on your server, and they presume that you're going to set up a firewall on your server to lock it down. And even for me, when I'm running an EC2, I want to make sure that all of my firewall configuration is set up on the server as well. And sometimes there's things like I proxy one port to another through the firewall using IP tables or something. And on Debian and Ubuntu, you might use UFW. Ansible has a module for it that makes it really easy to set up UFW. Since this is a CentOS server, I'm going to say, I'm going to install firewall-d. So I'm going to say, let's see, install firewall-d package. So I will use package here, but whatever. Name firewall-d state present. And then I also want to make sure it's running. Name, ensure firewall-d is running. And service, name firewall-d state. What is it? Started, enabled, yes. And then I also want to give it a basic configuration. So I need to open the SSH port, and I want to, this might be set up as a web server, so I'll open up port 80 for it. And then if I was doing secure, it would also be on port 443 and port 123 for NTP services. So I'm going to say name, configure ports in firewall, firewall-d. Ansible has a module for it, just like UFW. And I'll give it a state, which we're going to use a loop. So I'm going to say item.state and port, item.port, which we'll define in the loop in just a moment. Zone external. So this is for external traffic coming to the server. Immediate, yes, we want it to be applied immediately, and we want these rules to be permanent. I can never spell the word permanent. Yes. And then the ports that we're going to do, actually, since this isn't running HTTPD right now, so we're just going to open a couple ports we need. So we're going to say state enabled port 2849 TCP, and we'll do the port. So that one is for SSH, and then we'll do state enabled port 123 UDP. And that is going to be for NTP, which we haven't set up, but I would set that up in a few minutes. And so if I run this, so first I'm going to run nmap to check what ports are open on the server. So I'm going to go over here, exit out of here, and I'm going to run nmap, and it's going to check for open ports, all the 1,000 most common ports on a server. And right now it can see all these different things that are open to the public internet. After I run this, it shouldn't be finding any of those ports. And since it's not going to scan 2849, since it's not a very common port, and since nothing's running on 123 yet because I don't have NTP set up, it's not going to find that one, and it'll just keep searching because now I have my server locked down a bit. Once it does it, of course. And we're starting to get close to the end time. I was hoping I would be able to get through everything. I can probably finish off talking about a couple of these other things without any elaborate example. But I will mention, once this is done, a way that you can do all the things that I just did and then some using a role from Ansible Galaxy that I maintain called the geerlingguy security. And while it's doing this, why is it taking so long to configure these ports? This should be really quick. Live demos are always great. So while it's doing that, I will show you on Galaxy. I have a role. Well, that's really annoying. 2849. Oh, you know what? I wonder. Oh, I'm not logged into it either. I think I started the firewall and it probably blocks 2849 by default. And now I can't log into it. So I just locked myself out of the server. But that shows you that the firewall is actually working. It's working a little too well. I should probably do this part after this part. And that way the firewall would have worked and I would not have locked myself out. So when you're working on firewalls, you should probably also be logged into your server. Anyways, but if I do run nmap, it's not going to find anything because nothing is accessible in the ports that nmap is scanning. And so that's great. So that's a firewall. And I killed my live demo anyways, but we're hitting time, so that's perfectly fine, I guess. But I was going to show you on Galaxy, I have a security role, which, let me filter by roles. It's a little bit slow right now. Not sure why. Maybe I brought down Galaxy. There we go. So I have a security role that does all of these things, but in a little bit more detail, and it does a few other things too. For example, it installs fail to ban by default, which will monitor logs for things like people trying to brute force log into your server, and it will block IP addresses based on the rules that you set up in there. It does a couple other tweaks to make it a little bit easier to set up a server's first 5 minutes of security. This is only for Linux, so if you're using Windows or other types of servers, or if you're running containers, this role is not quite as useful, but it does do all the things that I've done in the past hour very quickly and easily, and has pretty secure defaults. There's a few open PRs for things that make it even a little bit harder. But the other things that I was going to mention are log files. One of the nice things about fail to ban is it uses your log files to see when people are trying to hack your server, and it blocks them that way. You can also set it up to do things like if it notices in your web application log that somebody keeps hitting a bunch of URLs that are obviously it's trying to scan for a vulnerability, you can have it block IPs based on that as well. So that's a nice tool to use. And finally, I have some more information in the end of the chapter about security enhanced Linux. I mentioned earlier up here that SSH, to run it on a different port, we change it with the SE port module. There's a lot of things on CentOS servers especially, or Red Hat, where you might run into a problem where it's like, oh, there's permission denied, that kind of thing. A lot of people at that point will just turn off SE Linux because that's the easiest way. But that, in my opinion, it's a lot similar to running chmod 777 and giving everyone in the world permission to your files. It solves the problem, but at what cost? You know, a lot of hacks are from little insecurity issues that are caused by tweaks to make things easier. And once you go down that road, it starts leading to a lot worse security. So make sure that you are more formal and take into account security when you're automating all of your servers. Anyway, so I didn't get much time to glance at live chat today. So if I didn't answer a question you had, please consider posting it in the comments below here. I will read all of those, although it's been a little bit difficult since those other two videos kind of exploded in popularity last week. My YouTube comments that I'm usually able to read through every day were kind of polluted with lots of other crazy comments from, shall we call it, the deep end of YouTube. And but I will try to answer those questions next week. Next week's episode will probably be on Ansible Tower and AWX. That's kind of it's a probably because I'm trying to make sure that I can update the book section on those topics in chapter 11. So we'll see if I can get to that. Another topic that I will probably approach is Docker. But also next week on this day is an exciting day for me because I'm kind of a space nerd. We're going to have the first rocket launch in the US by SpaceX that has astronauts going up to the International Space Station. And I don't really care where it is in the world, but having human space flight, have more human space flight is awesome. So I'm always excited to see those kind of things. So luckily my episode of Ansible 101 will not conflict with the timing of that. That will be later in the day. So if you want to watch both, you still can. I know that everybody probably has this bookmarked on their schedule and not the space flight, but if you want to watch both, you can. So anyway, thank you very much. I hope that you're learning about things. I hope that if your part of the world is opening up right now, that you're able to do things safely and help prevent too much of the spread of the current pandemic. So, hopefully everybody's doing well. I will I will continue to do these episodes as long as I can. I'm probably going to end up finishing up in the next 3 or 4 episodes, just because it takes a little bit of prep work and things that take some time, and it takes some time away from doing some other things like open source contribution. But as we saw today during the live stream, somebody found the issue with validation for SSH deconfig, which I'll add to the book and make it better. So that was very awesome, and I saw there were plenty of clap emojis in the live chat. So thank you very much. But anyway, thank you. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.